Welcome to Politics Chat, in which I try to answer your questions about modern politics. Let me jump into some of the other big questions that are on your minds today. And the first of that, I want to call out that today is the 61st anniversary of the enactment of Medicare and Medicaid under Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1965, July 30th, 1965. He signed that piece of the Social Security Act, which was passed in 1935, into law. And so we are on the 61st anniversary of Medicare and Medicaid, the two original health programs for the American people. And I wanted to tell you just a little bit about that because it matters. And the what I mean by it matters is obviously it matters to people, but the ideology behind creating Medicare and Medicaid is the one that the people who are currently in charge of the Republican Party and thus of the country are trying to change to a different ideology. So it's kind of worth thinking about. The idea of health care provided by the government for people actually comes all the way back from Theodore Roosevelt at the turn of the 1900s into that century. And that was kind of a non starter in the progressive era. It didn't go very far. But after World War II in 1945, President Harry Truman called for a universal system of healthcare in the United States. And that really made sense coming out of World War II and coming out of the Depression. One of the things that pushes the idea of the Social Security Act of 1935 and of the programs that the Democrats embrace during the Depression before World War II is actually inspired by a movement to protect the elderly who really in the Depression are really hard hit because, of course, without Social Security, without the sorts of programs like Medicare and Medicaid that we have now, the elderly didn't have places to live and they didn't, it was hard to move home with your kids if or to work to live with your kids simply because you were another mouth to feed. And so there's actually a guy named Francis Townsend. He's a doctor who's in California, and he looks out of his window and he sees two elderly women eating out of a trash can. And he says, we have to do better than this. And he starts a movement to try and ameliorate the conditions of the elderly in during the Depression. And he actually is not the person who ends up getting into power to do something, but that idea that the country has to do something to make sure that you don't have elderly people living on the street is one of the real pushes for the New Deal. So after World War II, Truman, who takes over after Franklin Delano Roosevelt dies on April 12th, 45, he calls for a healthcare program for the elderly. And he really can't get it going anywhere for a number of reasons, but it really doesn't take off, although that impulse is certainly there. And it is LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who is able to put Medicare and Medicaid into place July 30th, 1965. And so it's sort of a historic day. And the reason that I gave you that whole wind up with the history of Medicare and Medicaid is because most of your questions today were about the news reports that the Trump administration is trying to get rid of Medicaid. And Medicare was the original system that helped the elderly, and Medicaid was the original system that helped people who were living in a certain level of poverty. But one of the key pieces today, when you think about that difference between Medicare and Medicaid, is that Medicaid generally is the support for assisted living and nursing homes and the kinds of things like wheelchairs, the kinds of thing, the apparatus that the elderly need. Now, not always, but that's sort of when people talk about cutting Medicaid and they think about it just being about poverty, it's actually often the subsidies that make it possible for people to be in a nursing home, for example. So what's going on with Medicare and Medicaid and the Trump administration? And it's really confusing because there's a big story right now that dropped on Tuesday in the Wall Street Journal that is getting blown up and conflated with two other stories. And a lot of people are confused about it. So, what happened was that on Tuesday, in the Wall Street Journal, a reporter named Anna Wild Matthews reported that the Trump administration is ending at the end of this year a program started under former President Joe Biden that provided subsidies to the purchasing of prescription drugs under Medicare Part D. That's the prescription drug part of Medicare. And the trick to those subsidies was that they provided money directly to insurers to keep premiums low for people on Medicare Part D. And they also, the Biden administration also capped the annual amount of money that somebody under Medicare had to put toward prescription drugs. At the time, it was 2000. It's gone up since then, for cost of living stuff. And they also allowed the government to negotiate with drug companies for prices. And the Republicans really, really, really hated that. Although, by the way, it is we are the only developed country, and most not developed countries either, that doesn't permit the government to negotiate in some fashion or to cap the price of drugs in their country. I've written a ton about this. If you're interested, just look at my name and Google drug subsidies, or Google. I haven't done it, so I'm guessing the words Medicaid probably. Although I write about Medicaid a lot, so that you may get more than you want. I did this back during the Biden administration. I explained this stuff in real detail. Anyway, the Trump administration wants to get rid of those subsidies for the Medicare Part D drug purchasing that has kept those costs down. And they are doing so because they are complaining that the government subsidies go directly to the insurers, the health insurers. And that's their argument for not doing it, is they're going to the people and saying, hey, the government's just paying insurers and you don't want us to do that. But Mehmet Oz, who is the administrator for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, says that the government intends to is stabilizing the market so this bailout is no longer needed. And they claim that this will actually lower the costs of prescription medication for people who are on Medicare Part D. Those people who are looking at it, though, who are not part of the government, actually don't think that that's going to be the case for most people. And they do point out that because of some of the details I'm not going to go into right now, that this may push people into Medicare Advantage, which is the private insurer version of Medicare. And that is something that the Republicans have wanted for a long time, is to get rid of Medicare and push people toward a private system in which the government contracts with a private insurer to provide services to the elderly. And again, I've written a ton about that as well, and you can Google that. So that's the story that's in the news. These subsidies are going to end, at least they say that. I'm going to suggest you can push back on that. Are going to end at the end of 2026, and the administration maintains that this will make care cheaper and better. I don't trust anything they say. So it's up to you. You can trust it. I have my grave doubts about that. Anyway, that's one of the stories. And that's the story that broke on Tuesday, and that now you're seeing stories all the time. He's going after Medicare. He's going after Medicaid. The specifics today, as of Tuesday, are just about the end of those subsidies to Medicare Part D. But that's getting rolled into other stories that we should be paying attention to. The first of those is that the Trump administration has stopped payments to Medicaid payments to California and Minnesota. Lots of them, insisting that Medicaid payments to those states have been fraudulent. And I've written a lot about that they are, that's Medicaid, by the way, not Medicare. That's there is something called an error rate in the way that they analyze payments in Medicaid, and that error rate is associated with people using the wrong code in paperwork. So it's not at all clear. This is not individual fraud as much as it is just the paperwork, basically, is what people who study this stuff say. I don't study this myself. I just read what other people say. But they are pretty clearly trying to punish California and Minnesota. For some reason, Trump just has a total bee in his bonnet about Minnesota, probably because Tim Walz is there and Tim Walz called him weird. And also, he really loathes, with a capital L, Gavin Newsom, whom he clearly sees as top candidate for the Democratic nomination in 2028 and is trying to cut him off at the ankles. So that story is also there. Trump is trying to establish the precedent of simply saying to states, we're not going to fund your Medicaid. So good luck, because you're engaging in fraud. And somebody asked me a couple of weeks ago, can they do that? And one of the very rare times in which the federal government can do that, although they have been doing stuff like that under Trump, completely illegally to my mind. But the one of the few times you can withhold payments, federal payments for Medicaid, is under suspicion of fraud. So they're very deliberately using that. So there's that story out there as well. But then the really big story that is getting conflated into that story from Tuesday is the bigger story. And that is that, if you remember, the July 4th, 2025, One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the bill that the law that the Republicans pushed through Congress without any Democratic votes under something called budget reconciliation. I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, this is so in the weeds. And I understand why people lose track of it, because, like, literally, this is what I study. And I'm like, okay, here's this lane, here's this lane, here's this lane. And I'm sorry about that. I'm trying to make it as clear as I can. But the weeds kind of matter, because having passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act under budget reconciliation can't be filibustered. So what it means is that they could slam this through without any Democratic support. And they did, and they gave us this One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And it was essentially the Republican wish list forever and ever. It essentially screwed over anything Democrats wanted and just gave the Republicans what they wanted. And in that One Big Beautiful Bill Act of July 4th, 2025, a little bit more than a year ago, there were cuts of about $1 trillion to Medicare and Medicaid. I'm sorry, to Medicaid, not to Medicare, to Medicaid over 10 years. So you can see the tearing back of money from Medicaid, especially, which, as I say, they focus on that as being about poverty. It's also about elder care. And those three stories wrapped together are why you're seeing politicians, especially Democratic politicians, going, they're coming after your Medicare and your Medicaid, and people getting really confused and thinking that they're going to lose Medicare. And the truth is, there's three separate stories: Medicare Part D, end of subsidies; clawing back of Medicaid to Minnesota and California; and major cuts to Medicaid over 10 years because of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So that's what's all going on there. But the reason I wanted to set it up there, and you guys are probably all like, I'm out of here, I'm going to go for a run because I can't take any more of this stuff. And I would not blame you for that. The reason I wanted to set it up the way I did is because Truman, and by the way, when LBJ signed the Medicare and Medicaid measure into law, he gave the first Medicaid card to Truman to say, you're really the father of this program. Anyway, that idea that the government should help people, should create, safety nets, should make it possible for the elderly not to have to worry about their health care, should extend people's lives. That theory is the one that the Republican Party in its current incarnation is doing their best to tear apart, because they disagree with that. They don't think the government should do that. They think the government should concentrate wealth among a really small group of people with the idea that individual investors will be able to make better decisions about how to invest in the economy than the government can with its regulations and so on, so that you want the efficiency of private markets. But at the same time, that sort of ballooned into the idea that some people should rule over other people. And you've got Donald Trump now using the government to funnel contracts and to use taxpayer money to benefit himself and his cronies. And you're seeing here in the struggle over things like Medicare Part D, the pushback on the idea that the government should help individuals and help people survive as a community, things like that President Biden really threw himself behind. And instead, you're really seeing this administration double down on this different ideology that what the government really needs to do is it needs to focus on enabling individual men for the most part, to be able to do whatever they want, sort of give them all the leads you want so that they can all the lead they want so that they can create these successful businesses and they can do things in really successful ways. And that what you really want to do is not bog these great minds, these great men down with the problems of the community. And the reason I wanted to set those two things up that way is because the other thing that is very much on people's minds is the Iran war. And in many ways, the Iran war is the ideology I just talked about on steroids, right? The idea that you don't need to mess around with, negotiations, and you don't need to mess around with international alliances and all the stuff that came out of World War II. You don't have to worry about things like international agreements and trying to get rid of problems like the Iranian ambition for a nuclear weapon with negotiations, the way somebody like Barack Obama did, along with a bunch of other countries, with the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that was working. That instead of doing that, what you really need to do is just trust to a few individuals that are kind of better than everybody else and stronger than everybody else, and they can dominate. And that's pretty clearly what Trump's idea was when he tore up the JCPOA and when he decided that what he was going to do is he was going to go into Iran and just bomb it, get rid of the leaders of Iran and dominate the ones who remained in order to impose his will on Iran. But here's a news flash. We are seeing, I think, in real time that ideology was always false. And I've talked a lot about how it comes out of the cowboy mythology in the United States of America and so on. And I'm not going to go into all that now, but that's sort of, I'm a cowboy, I'm coming in out of nowhere, and I'm going to be rootin' tootin' and shoot everybody, was always a myth. And it was a very important myth, a very interesting myth. But the reality was that is not actually how you can run a successful government. And I will point out something that the whole people who embrace the cowboy mythology, like Ronald Reagan and Rush Limbaugh and all those people, never talked about, was that their cowboys were supposed to come in, do something, get rid of the bad guys, and then go away, right? They ride off into the sunset. That was the central part of the theme, that they would leave behind a world for people to create a healthy community. And so we're sitting here right now with this war in Iran, and reports coming out as of last night that Trump is incredibly frustrated because he can't impose his will on Iran. And in fact, Iran is simply continuing to say, we're going to control the Strait of Hormuz. And until you do what we say, we're not going to let you have any energy, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing that. And that war is starting to spread. And that's a real problem for everybody, but certainly for the United States of America. And I hate to start. I mean, I am an Americanist, but lots and lots and lots of people have died in this war. I mean, starting with the bombing of this kids' school, right? So I think the reason the way I'm emphasizing it now is not to underplay that, but to suggest that ideology that is attacking Medicare and Medicaid and so on, it also is the ideology that gave us the Iran war. and that you can see has really painted us into a corner because it never worked anyway. And so now I think what we are seeing is this ideology really the rubber meeting the road, and people looking at it and saying, "Hey, wait a minute here. The number of Americans who approve of this war and approve of what's happened because of it, the inflation, especially in gas, is under 30%. I mean, that's usually a president's floor, even if things are really bad, is about 30%. Trump is below that on Iran. And there doesn't seem to be a way out. And he's incredibly frustrated. He appears to be screaming at people over it, but he's backed himself into a corner on Iran. And things are very touch and go right now for a couple of reasons. One, because as I say, it's starting to spread. And secondly, because the United States is running low on the munitions it needs to combat the missiles that Iran has been, about the anti missile defense systems that we rely on, and that's deeply problematic for the United States, not only in Iran, but it is deeply problematic for our protections around the rest of the world. And this watching this fall apart is really. I don't have words for it. If you follow anybody who does foreign affairs, they're just sitting there saying, we had no idea that you could ruin American foreign policy as quickly as Trump has done it. And lots and lots of speculations about what things might look like going forward. But that whole idea of I can just come in with a baseball bat and do whatever I want is playing out in a number of other places as well. So, yesterday, I think it was, or earlier this week, the American State Department was at an AIDS conference in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, in Brazil. And a US government official put up a map in this event, international event, put up a map of Africa, and they had mislabeled every country in Africa. And the hallmarks, the watermarks on the slide indicate, or on the presentation, suggested it was an AI presentation. But what on earth do you think that does to our international standing when we're at an international conference and we put up a map of Africa in which they have mislabeled? They didn't have all the countries from Africa. They were focusing on a certain number of them. They had put the wrong names on all of those. And they tried to say, oh, this was an intern, or this was somebody who was in a hurry, whatever. Anybody who was talking about AIDS and apparently focusing on AIDS in Africa should have been able to look at that and say, those are not the right countries. And that I think the idea, again, of America not needing to pay attention to things like negotiations or colleagues in other countries and so on, shows when you will go to a conference and be so ill-informed that you would put up a map that's got the wrong names of the countries on it. And this is, by the way, has become an international story because it's so appalling. I got to say, as a college professor, if anybody did that in my classroom, um, honestly, it really wouldn't even be a failing grade. I would say, we can't go forward with this. You need to go do this again. So that's, I think, a sign of just how much we're watching this ideology weaken us on the international community. But there's another piece of it that you asked about, and that is, why is the Trump administration so tied up in knots about the International Criminal Court, the ICC, to which the United States is not a signator? So why are they suddenly going after it and really trying to destroy it and saying how everybody in it is, they've got all sorts of insults for the people in it and so on? Why are they doing that? And there's a couple of interesting stories out about that within the last 2 days. And that is that, again, the idea that America can just do what it wants seems to have led a number of the officials in the Trump administration over the line to the point that they are concerned about future prosecutions by the International Criminal Court if Democrats get back into power. And what they're really pointing to is something I mentioned on Tuesday, and that is, and I'm not saying this is exclusive. There's many places in which foreign countries have issues with the United States, including, by the way, Mexico, for the people who have been killed by ICE or in detention. They're people who are in detention, and that's a really interesting story as well, that I'm just going to give you a hint of, because I'll probably write about it soon and I don't have much time now. But in the 19th century, in the first half of the 19th century, Mexicans and Mexican Americans, because it's not until the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that we're going to have the border of Mexico move as far south as it does. But there's real problems with lynching of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the 1840s in the United States. And the government of Mexico goes to the government of the U.S. and says, "Hey, you're going to kill our people. You're going to pony up cash." And it's that requirement of, or the suit saying, stop killing our people, or we're going to start asking for money, or we're going to make you give over more money. They actually do ask for money, that gets the government to start cracking down on lynching of Mexican Americans. And there's fascinating work being done on that. And that idea of other countries saying, "Hey, wait a minute here, you keep saying these people are going to be deported. They're our nationals, and you're killing our nationals." There's a lot of room there, at least historically, for countries to get very angry at the United States over that, and perhaps demand payment at the very least. At least that's what they did historically. But what they seem to be most concerned about is the administration strikes on the small boats in the Caribbean and in the Eastern Pacific. And those are, from the time they began happening on September 2nd, 2025, there has been real concern that those were extra legal. The Trump administration has claimed that the people they killed on those boats were trafficking drugs, but there is they've offered no evidence of that at all. And there was a story that came out earlier this week in which the officials in the United States who are responsible for monitoring drug trafficking, say that these strikes have made no difference at all in the amount of cocaine coming to the United States. It was always cocaine with these boats. The Trump administration implied it was fentanyl, but it was not. It was cocaine. But it's made no difference at all. So they are trying, it appears, to defang the ICC before they can be brought up for committing potential crimes that the International Criminal Court could go after. And that is not just the crimes of apparent murder, but also potential war crimes. Again, there's a lot of discussion about whether or not some of those strikes, not all of them, but some of them, are war crimes. And that's, I'm not going there, but they're clearly concerned about that. Again, this idea that they were just going to do it, they were powerful enough, this was the United States, they could get away with it, seems to be running into the shoals, as it were. So those things are all on the table. But now, again, I'm going to have to run because I'm about to interview Senator Andy Kim at 6:45. So I'm only going to go on for another 5 minutes before I flip over to him. Come join us if you would. But so there's a couple of things here that, in terms of this idea that Trump and his people can get away with anything, that the ideology under which they're operating, in which Trump certainly has been operating in his second term, that is starting to run aground, as I say, coming up shoal, that you're starting to see here. And for example, there is this struggle over the confirmation of Todd Blanche, who's the acting attorney general, as to be the real attorney general. And you have two Republican senators, Tom Tillis of North Carolina and John Cornyn of Texas, who are bottling up the nomination in the Judiciary Committee in the Senate because they want to see in writing that Blanche has gotten rid of that slush fund, the $1.776 billion slush fund, and the alleged agreement that the Department of Justice would never go after Trump, his sons, the Trump organization, or their associates for anything in their tax returns up until May of this year. And they're pushing back, and they're saying, "Hey, wait a minute here. You actually can't get away with doing anything you want." Now, that doesn't really matter in this case because um, it appears there'll be a legal fight over it, but it appears that Blanche can continue as the acting AG for as long as he wants, because that is a Senate confirmed position. I'm not going to take a stand on that. The lawyers will figure that one out. But here's the other place to be watching this, and that is over Epstein, over the Epstein files. Todd Blanche has, a judge has said that he essentially admitted they were violating the law, the Epstein Files Transparency Act, because they were not releasing the Epstein files as the law requires. And today, Katie Fang, who's an independent journalist, has sued for unredacted documents, a series of unredacted documents, not all of them, that she said were wrongly redacted, and a judge forced the Department of Justice to hand those over unredacted today. The Department of Justice has put out a document saying it did so. I remain suspicious. We'll see. But you can see this sort of "you can get away with anything" ideology kind of starting to get pulled back. And that leaves us with the last point I will make today. I don't know if you saw this, but Elon Musk, after the last election, said he was going to pull back. He was not going to be investing in politics any longer. And yet a news report came out within the last day or so that he will put at least 100 million and perhaps more than that into the midterm elections to elect Republicans. And that goes back to the fact he is determined to keep Republicans in power. I suspect because he, like other people, are concerned about the legality of the things that they have done under this ideology that they can get away with whatever they want to. So I think what you're seeing here is this ideology of things like the establishment of Medicare and Medicaid reasserting itself in the face of this sort of cowboy ideology that has gotten us into this war we can't get out of, and is raising the possibility that the legal system is going to chunk back on these people exercising that ideology, and they're really starting to be concerned about real repercussions for their behavior. And that will mean, we're sort of in this catch 22, if you will. That will mean, on the one hand, that the more we do to push back and to focus on reclaiming our democracy, the more we do that, the more you will see people like Elon Musk throwing money at these elections, Trump trying to get the SAVE Act passed. Now he's gone to the Supreme Court to ask it to stop mail-in voting. They're desperate to stay in power. So the rest of this summer, right through to December at least, is going to be, the word I'm thinking of has two similar syllables, but let's say a real mess. If you'd like to tune in live, I record these chats on Tuesday and Thursday at 6 p.m. Maine time on both my YouTube channel and my Facebook page. If you want to hear more from me, I write Letters from an American every night. It's available on Substack and on Facebook, and the audio version of the nightly letter is available the following day wherever you get your podcasts. And finally, on Saturday mornings, I talk with Dr. Joanne Freeman, the historian of the early republic, professor, and dear friend, about history and politics. We call our talks "What the Heck Just Happened?" and you can find them on YouTube. Politics Chat is produced by Lauren Westfall, music by Andrea Von Kampen.